is asking, Peter Summer, I'm a local, I'm fourth generation Washingtonian, I'm a press owner. People are asking, are you going to be investigating the misuse of the DC budget surplus? What's happening is 50% of the budget goes from taxpayers and federal dollars into condo developments. That's the big issue. And they haven't looked at it for decades. This is the first time congressional oversight has looked at the District of Columbia since like the 90s almost.
If you have information on that you can get to my team,
Oh, yeah.
I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, because it's subsidizing condos. So these are affordable housing that we have. Do you have this type of affordable housing in Tennessee and Memphis or something?
I talked to Ty here.
Yeah, so that's what's happening. Our surplus has to go by law into housing, which is those condos that you have, and that's going, and DOB, the zoning and permitting, are just allowing anything to go up. And that's honest service fraud.
Yeah, no, if you can get that
Yeah.
to our team,
All right, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Good to see you.
About this very important issue, and I thought we could start our conversation today by briefly talking about how did you get involved in this effort?
Well, being involved in the effort is the exercise of my constitutional duties and authority. I'm a member of the United States Senate. Congress has oversight responsibility for the district. But importantly, I'm the ranking member on the subcommittee in the Appropriations Committee that has oversight of the district's budget. Taking a hard look at what was happening here in the district, it is extremely concerning. The attitude that's been displayed. I think everybody that lives or works here, and of course I only do that on a temporary basis, but is concerned about the crime wave that is taking place here. I worry about my own staff. I certainly worry about my constituents that come to visit here. And let's not forget, this is the federal district of Columbia. This is our nation's capital. And we all have an investment in this capital. We need to see it as a beacon of freedom and hope and liberty, not as an embarrassment to the nation. Yet the D.C. Council seemed set on a course that would be embarrassing for our nation, would increase crime and incentivize a worsening of the situation as over and above that.
Well, you mentioned you have a constitutional obligation as a member of the Senate to oversee what happens here in the District of Columbia. Now, in the early 1970s, Congress passed the Home Rule Act, which devolved certain powers back to local officials, but it ultimately gave the House and the Senate final say on what happens here in the district. Can you explain a little bit about how the Home Rule disapproval process works and what the Senate's role is in reviewing local legislation here in the district?
Zach, I thought you might ask me about this. So I thought I might actually.
I can't wonder why.
I thought I might actually just read the relevant section of the Home Rule Act and the Constitution.
Sure.
I'm going to start with the Constitution just to set the context for this.
Always a good place to start.
Then we'll go to the Home Rule Act. But Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, when it's talking about the powers of Congress, it clearly states in reference to the District of Columbia that Congress shall, quote, exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district, that being the District of Columbia.
Sure.
Now let's go to the Home Rule Act. Title 6 of the D.C. Home Rule Act says, notwithstanding any other provision of this Act, the Congress of the United States reserves the right at any time to exercise its constitutional authority as legislature for the district by enacting legislation for the district on any subject, whether within or without the scope of legislative power granted to the council by this act. And I want to emphasize this, including legislation to amend or repeal any law enforced in the district prior to or after enactment of this act and any act passed by the council. Squarely putting in place the attempt by the D.C. Council to pass this reform, as they call it, this change in the criminal code here in the district.
Excellent. Now, I understand the disapproval process under the Home Rule Act. Their timelines are a little bit different. The legislative process is a little bit different than how legislation normally makes its way through the Senate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly, and this is important. The resolution of disapproval that I brought about had certain privileges that does make it quite different. First, because it's a criminal statute. The criminal statute has special treatment. There's a 60-day review period for that statute. Also, and I think this is most important, it's privileged, which means it gets discharged to the floor without getting stuck in committee. This has happened to other pieces of legislation where they're stuck in his gag. This goes straight to the floor. I have the ability to do that, and it requires 51 votes, not a 60-vote not a 60-vote threshold. So those privileges have made it possible for me to get this done on an expedited basis, and a timely basis, and not be held up by the majority leader or by committee leadership that would otherwise perhaps frustrate us.
Excellent. Now, there was a dispute, I remember, with the local DC City Council about the timing issue of this disapproval process. I know DC Council Chairman Phil Mendelson, he tried to withdraw the legislation at one point. I think at the time he called it a, quote, desperate, made-up maneuver by the chairman. Why do you think the DC City Council tried to recall this piece of legislation?
Well, I can say this, there's no basis in the Constitution nor in the DC Home Rule Act for what they proposed to do. So obviously they made it up as they went along. If Mr. Mendelson were here, he could answer that question himself, I presume. The only thing I can imagine is they had a sobering experience of realizing that not only was I against this, but they could tell that the weight of the Senate was coming their way. It turned out that 81 senators voted for this resolution of disapproval. Veto-proof majority in the Senate, I might add. And I think that if you looked at the polls here in the district, 72% of the people in the District of Columbia were with me on this. So perhaps reality caught up to the DC Council.
Right. Well, I think it's worth looking at briefly. We talk a lot about what the revised criminal code would do. And it's pretty clear it would eliminate all mandatory minimum sentences except for first-degree murder. It would lower the maximum penalties for many crimes, again, including for first-degree murder. And so it makes sense why so many were opposed to this. And I'm curious, Senator, if you can briefly talk about maybe some of the conversations you had with local residents or people who are involved in the local criminal justice system and why they thought these specific provisions would be so problematic.
Well, the only conversations I had with people reaching out to me, thanking me for stepping up to address this. People reaching out to me beforehand, telling me how concerned they were that this is absolutely the wrong message to send. At a time when you have escalating crime here in the district, you mentioned some of the statistics. In the past 3 years alone, we see a trebling of the number of carjackings here in the district. Over 200 homicides a year each of the past 2 years. And in February, when I was looking at the data, those statistics were up even 20% over the year prior. It's still accelerating. To come in at this point in time and to say, yes, we should lower the penalties for these major crimes, it sends absolutely the wrong message, a contrary message to what we need to be sending in terms of supporting law enforcement, law and order in the district. And there's something else that this proposed law would have done, which I think has sort of been skimmed over by the media, but if you think about the practical implications, it's significant. It would have entitled most every misdemeanor in the district to a jury trial. The district's already backed up in terms of getting major felonies to jury trial. Can you imagine if every misdemeanor were entitled to a jury trial too? It would completely clog the system. It would lock it up. So what does a prosecutor do in that circumstance? The prosecutor is going to have to focus on the felonies. That's what, that's the most dangerous thing happening here. So the District of Columbia becomes a catch and release haven for criminal elements because they're not going to prosecute misdemeanors. That's going to be the practical result of this. Can you imagine what it would be like here in the district if no misdemeanor is prosecuted or able to be prosecuted because there are not the resources to do it? That's exactly what the implications would have been had the DC Council gotten its way.
Well, one of the points I think that's worth emphasizing, Senator, if the district were a state, as so many have advocated for the past few years, would Congress have been able to intervene like it did and disapprove this resolution?
Well, first I'll say this. So many people fail to read the components of the Constitution that I just read you. There is no constitutional authority for D.C. to become a state. Go all the way back to when Bobby Kennedy was Attorney General. He determined that at that point in time. I think they're very creative attempts to reread the Constitution, to make up laws as folks wish they would be here in Washington rather than what they say. But there is no avenue. There's no legal avenue, there's no constitutional avenue for this district, this federal District of Columbia, to be a state. The reasons that Democrats would like to see that is because they like to have 2 more members of the United States Senate. I understand the practical goal that they have. It's an aim to get more power. But a power grab is not a reason to violate the Constitution. It would take a lot more work than some people in the Democrat side of my institution seem to believe.
Other pieces of legislation.
And those aren't privileged in the way that a criminal statute modification would be.
So my question then is, Senator, if Congress is unable to act within those timeframes, what other tools or mechanisms are available either to you and your colleagues in the Senate or to folks in the House to counteract some of this radical legislation coming out of D.C.?
As I mentioned, I'm the ranking member of the Appropriations Subcommittee that has oversight of the district. So this has been used in the past as well. You just don't fund certain areas that the District of Columbia might be requesting funding for. That's one way to do it. There are probably a number of other ways we could look at it, but I think the most responsible way is the way myself and my team handle this. We're going to review these quickly, and we're going to, apply our constitutional discretion as necessary. The district needs to get its act back in order, and rather than taking steps that would encourage more crime and more laws in the district, I hope that they go back to the drawing board now and come up with something that would actually strengthen the deterrence mechanisms that are available to them and make this district a safer place.
Well, you mentioned that they should go back to the drawing board. I noticed D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, she released her budget for next year earlier this week. As part of that budget, she proposed eliminating the Criminal Code Reform Commission that kind of put forward many of these radical proposals. And so I guess, what do you think happens next? Do you think D.C. will go back to the drawing board? Do you think they'll try to break this up into pieces? I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think the mayor has clearly had an awakening because she vetoed these provisions that have been so troubling. And to see her come back and take this commission down to defund it, I think is an appropriate move. Clearly, this commission was far and away, on a different planet than the majority of the residents in the district, and certainly I think the majority of Americans. If you look at the vote that we cast in the Senate, 81 members of the Senate, 81% of the Senate stood with me on it. I think that America has had it with this whole defund the police movement, soft on crime, being critical of law enforcement, being non-supportive of law enforcement. I think certainly in Tennessee, we want to support law enforcement. We want to enhance their capabilities, let them know that we appreciate them, not defund them, and not make their jobs harder. So I think that message is beginning to filter into the district, and I'm encouraged by the actions of the mayor in terms of her budget priorities.
I am curious, in other contexts, particularly with the Congressional Review Act, if Congress steps in to disapprove a legislative rulemaking action, in some instances then that agency is prohibited from taking that same action unless Congress explicitly approves future action. And so I'm curious, since the D.C. City Council's so-called reform effort was so abysmal, what role should Congress play as they consider future legislation? Should Congress step in, hold hearings, and pass a revised criminal code? Should members of the local D.C. Council come testify in front of Congress about potential reforms? What do you think this process looks like?
Well, all of the above are possible because the provisions that I read you are actually quite broad in terms of our constitutional authority and the D.C. Home Rule Act authorities. What I would hope would happen, though, is that the structures that have been put in place here in the district sober up and take a clear-eyed view of what the challenges truly are. And they take that sort of approach and perspective, and they come back to us with something that's responsible. I think we'll have a process that will begin to work again. If they want to stay on this same vector, I presume the mayor will continue to try to veto it, and I'll be in the same position that I have been with respect to these irresponsible laws.
Well, I'm hopeful as well, but I know police is also a major issue in the district right now. Unfortunately, the D.C. Council, they defunded the police, leading to what one local D.C. Council member, Charles Allen, said was, quote, the biggest reduction to MPD, that's the local D.C. police force, I've ever seen. And he said he was doing this in the name of racial justice. There was also onerous legislation that was recently passed, putting certain restrictions on local D.C. police. I think D.C. Council Chairman Phil Mendelson compared it to the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which did not pass at the federal level and had several problematic provisions. I know in the House there's been a disapproval resolution introduced to disapprove this police reform legislation. And so I'm curious, assuming it passes the House within the prescribed timeframes, do you think it could pass the Senate too?
The answer is it could, but I haven't had a chance to thoroughly go through this yet, so I'm not in a position at this point to give you my view in terms of how I come down on it. But again, I'll come back to the fact that we have broad authority here under the Constitution. I hope that message is received loud and clear by the District of Columbia.
Excellent. I did want to ask you about a tweet you sent earlier this week. It was in response to President Joe Biden. He signed the disapproval resolution earlier this week. And when he signed it, you said it was a victory for law and order, and it sends a message that resonates with crime-ridden cities across America. So I'm curious, what other actions can we hope to see from Congress that will help strengthen safety and security across our nation and continue to send this message?
Well, one action I can assure you of is a piece of legislation that Senator Marsha Blackburn and I introduced in the last Congress, and I intend to reintroduce again, that will reprogram. Well, I want to let you know that each day I wake up realizing and appreciating the fact that we live in the most exceptional nation in the world. My previous job before coming to the Senate, I was the ambassador to Japan. As a U.S. ambassador, you have a great privilege to represent this nation, and you think about it perhaps in a different way when you're overseas, and you can compare America to any other country. We are the greatest and the most exceptional nation in the world. We need to remember that. And rather than take away our competitive advantage, rather than destroy our strengths, which these defund the police sort of movements are doing, or attacks on our economy that some of my colleagues want to bring about, or anything that might weaken us in the international realm, we need to be speaking from a position of strength. And we only have strength abroad if we're strong here at home. In our first duty.
Yeah. Please join me in giving Senator
fantastic law enforcement organization, but stretched pretty thin. I think you probably agree. And the other aspect was that because we were treating these as federal cases and bringing in federal assistance for investigating, we could do more, I thought, than just prosecute a case here and a case there. We could look to see connections among defendants. We could try to figure out whether there was a network of gun traffickers from whom people were getting their guns. We were trying to get intelligence on where the gun's coming from. It's sort of like a drug trafficking investigation. It's important to address the issue of individual drug deals or individual drug possession, but you also want to know, ultimately, I think as the Senator was saying earlier, where's the dangerous thing, whether it's a drug from across the border or whether it's guns coming from somewhere else. There are no guns, we used to say this all the time, there are no guns that are manufactured in the District of Columbia. We'll put aside 3D printed guns and ghost guns and that sort of thing right now, but for the most part, they're coming in from somewhere else. And we wanted to develop that kind of intelligence so that not only were we addressing individual possessions in the district, but also addressing trafficking. So that was part of the goal. I will say, and I think this is very much a matter of public record, that that effort met with a lot of opposition from certain quarters for various reasons. And I still think that this is a good technique that should be considered pretty seriously. Obviously, you can tweak it in different ways to address whatever the circumstances are on the ground at the time. But the collaboration between the MPD and the federal authorities and the effort to try to address this as a bigger problem, I think is something that's well worth pursuing.
Well, Jessie, you made the cardinal mistake of trying to apply the 922G prosecutions to the places where the guns were found. In the districts where they were found, right?
Yes, I thought that was, I would frankly be, we ultimately, I would have liked to apply them across the board. That increases the number of prosecutions a lot, but because of resource constraints, my goal was, well, where are we going to focus? And I want to focus on the neighborhoods that are most beset by violent gun crime.
Right, which is pretty common sense. And I understand from reading and of course knowing you that eventually you did apply it across the 7 police districts. Of course, you're not going to find hardly any in 1D, 2D, 3D, etc. But one of the person's offices that opposed it was the city attorney, which in D.C. is called the AG. Carl Racine opposes USA prosecution of local gun cases in federal court as if D.C. is not part of the federal district. and his news release is April 22nd, 2020, for those of you who want to look it up. Let's switch our focus slightly to